Now here's the classification of burns we've already considered, dividing burns into superficial, partial thickness, and partial thickness can be shallow partial thickness or deeper partial thickness, full thickness, or the deeper type of burns. So now I want to think about the superficial types of burns, the so-called first degree burns. So we have burns here, and we're talking about the more superficial types of burns. Now what we're talking about here is we have the skin, the epidermis on top, and the dermis below. So dermis here, from here to here is dermis, epidermis on top, and the hypodermis, the subcutaneous areas below the dermis. Now with the superficial burns, this is affecting the epidermis. So here's an example of a superficial burn, and we see it's damaged the top part of the epidermis here. So superficial burns, it's the epidermis only that is affected. So epidermis only. But these burns are still painful. They're still very painful. Now you might remember that we said the nociceptors are found in the dermis, not in the epidermis above. And yet here I'm telling you that superficial epidermal burns are painful. Well, the reason is that burns cause a lot of inflammation, and the inflammation will go down from the burnt area in the epidermis and start affecting the nociceptors in the dermis. So they're still very painful injuries. And they also tend to be dry and red. Now the reason they're red is fairly obvious, because it's part of the inflammatory response. Heat, pain, redness, swelling is what we expect in the inflammatory response. But the superficial burns tend to be dry as well, because remember that the blood vessels, the arterioles, the capillaries, the millions of capillaries, the venules, they're confined to the dermis. And naturally the dermis is actually fairly moist. There's a lot of tissue fluid there. So as we'll see later, burns affecting the dermis can be very moist, exuding burns, but burns affecting the upper layer, the epidermis, usually are not. And these burns are going to blanch normally. The superficial burns are going to blanch normally. So they're going to blanch and they're going to reperfuse normally. And again, the reason for this is, even if there's a burnt area in the epidermis, when we apply pressure, it's going to close off the blood vessels in the dermis. Remember, with the blood cells going through here, it will squeeze out the blood cells from the dermal capillaries. And then when we let the pressure go, they'll just reperfuse as normal. So we get good blanching and we get good reperfusion effects with superficial burns. Basically normal blanching and reperfusing, in fact. And the healing is from the germinative layer of the skin, and normally takes about 3 to 6 days to get fairly good healing. Now the germinative layer in the skin is, if we imagine the boundary between the dermis and that's the surface of the skin, the boundary between the epidermis and the dermis there. Then we have the germinative cells, the germ cells here, that are preserved, because remember the burn is above here. So what we'll get is actually increased rates of mitosis in these germinative cells. These will move up and heal the burnt area. So we can see now they've moved into the burnt area and it's healing. And because this is by regeneration, these keratinocytes, these stem cells, healing by mitosis and regeneration, we can expect there to be no scarring. So that's first degree or superficial burns.